All right, we're back for part two of um, a miracle worker. Um, yeah. All righty. Helen wrestles to get free, but Annie pins her to the floor, closes her fingers upon the spoon, and lifts her, kicking under one arm. With her other hand, she gets the chair in place again and plunks Helen back on it. When she releases her hand, Helen throws the spoon at her. Annie now removes the plate of food, Helen grabbing, finding it missing, and commences to bang with her fists on the table. Annie collects a fistful of spoons and descends with them and the plate on Helen. She lets her smell the plate, at which Helen ceases banging, and Annie puts the plate down and a spoon in Helen's hand. Helen throws it on the floor. Annie puts another spoon in her hand. Helen throws it on the floor. When Annie comes to her last spoon, she sits next to Helen, and gripping the spoon in Helen's hand, compels her to take food in it up to her mouth. Helen sits with lips shut. Annie waits a stolid moment, then lowers Helen's hand. She tries again. This time, Helen suddenly opens her mouth and accepts the food. Annie lowers the spoon with a sigh of relief, and Helen spews the mouthful out at her face. Annie sits a moment with eyes closed, then takes the pitcher and dashes its water into Helen's face, who gasps astonished. Annie, with Helen's hand, takes up another spoonful and shoves it into her open mouth. Helen swallows involuntarily, and while she is catching her breath, Annie forces her palm open, throws four swift letters into it, then another four, and bows toward her with devastating pleasantness. Good girl. Annie lifts Helen's hand to feel her face nodding. Helen grabs a fistful of her hair and yanks. The pain brings Annie to her knees, and Helen pummels her. They roll under the table, and the lights commence to dim out on them. Simultaneously, the light at left has been rising slowly, so slowly that it seems at first we only imagine what is imitated in the yard. A few ghost-like figures in silence, motionless, waiting. Now the distant belfry chimes commence to toll the hour. Also very slowly, almost it is 12. Interminably, the sense is that of a long time passing. We can identify the figures before the 12th stroke, all facing the house in a kind of watch. Kate is standing exactly as before, but now with the baby Mildred sleeping in her arms, and placed here and there. Unmoving are Aunt Ev in her hat, with a hanky to her nose, and the two Negro children, Percy and Martha, with necks outstretched eagerly, and Vinny with a knotted kerchief on her head and a feather duster in her hand. The chimes cease, and there is silence. For a long moment, none of the group moves. What am I going to do, Miss Kate? It's noontime. Dinner's coming. I didn't get them breakfast dishes out of there yet. Kate says nothing, stares at the house. Martha shifts Helen's doll in her clutch, and it plaintively says, Mama. You run along, Martha. Aunt Ev blows her nose. I can't wait out here a minute longer. Kate, why this could go on all afternoon. 2. I'll tell the captain you called. You hear what Miss Kate say? Never you mind what's going on here. You run along, tend to your own business. Finally, Vinny turns on the children with the feather duster. Shoot! The two children divide before her. She chases them off. Aunt Ev comes to Kate on her dignity. Aunt Ev say, "What you like, Kate?" But that child is a killer. She opens her parasol preparatory to leaving. I needn't remind you that all the Kellers are cousins to General Robert E. Lee. I don't know who that girl is. She waits, but Kate, staring at the house, is without response. The only Sullivan I've heard of from Boston, too, and I'd think twice before locking her up with that kind, is that man, John L. And Aunt Ev departs with head high. Presently, Vinny comes to Kate, her arms out for the baby. You give me her, Miss Kate. I'll sneak her in back to her crib. But Kate is moveless until Vinny starts to take the baby. Kate looks down at her before relinquishing her. Kate, slowly, this child never gives me a minute's worry. Oh yes, this one's the angel of the family. No question about that. She begins off rear with the baby, heading around the house, and Kate now turns her back on it, her hand into her eyes. At this moment, there is the slamming of a door, and when Kate wheels, Helen is blundering down the porch steps into the light, like a ruined bat out of hell. Vinny halts and Kate runs in. Helen collides with her mother's knees and reels off and back to clutch them as her savior. Annie, with smoked glasses in hand, stands on the porch, also much undone, looking as though she had indeed just taken Vicksburg. Kate, taking in Helen's ravaged state, becomes steely in her gaze up at Annie. What happened? Annie meets Kate's gaze and gives a factual report, too exhausted for anything but a flat voice. She ate from her own plate. She thinks a moment. She ate with a spoon herself. Kate frowns, uncertain with thought, and glances down at Helen. And she folded her napkin. Kate's gaze now wavers from Helen to Annie and back. Folded her napkin? The room's a wreck, but her napkin is folded. She pauses then. I'll be in my room, Miss Keller. She moves to re-enter the house, but she stops at Vinny's voice. Don't be long, Miss Annie. Dinner'll be ready right away. Vinny carries Mildred around the back of the house. Annie stands unmoving, takes a deep breath, stares over her shoulder at Kate and Helen, then inclines her head graciously and goes with a slight stagger into the house. The lights in her room above steal up in readiness for her. Kate remains alone with Helen in the yard, standing protectively over her in a kind of wonder. Folded her napkin. She contemplates the wild head in her thighs and moves her fingertips over it with such a tenderness and something like a fear of its strangeness that her own eyes close. She whispers, bending to it. My Helen folded her napkin, and still erect with only her head in surrender, Kate, for the first time that we see, loses her protracted war with grief. But she will not let a sound escape her. Only the grimace of tears comes, and sobs that shake her in a grip of silence. But Helen feels them, and her head comes up in its own wandering to interrogate her mother's face until Kate buries her lips in the child's palm. Upstairs, Annie enters her room, closes the door, and stands back against it. The lights growing on her with their special color commence to fade on Kate and Helen. Then Annie goes wearily to her suitcase and lifts it to take it toward the bed, but it knocks an object to the floor. As she turns back to regard it, a new voice comes in a cultured murmur, hesitant as with the effort of remembering a text. And this soul, Annie puts the suitcase down and kneels to the object. It is the battered Perkins report, and she stands with it in her hands, letting memory try to speak. This blind, deaf, mute woman. Annie sits on her bed, opens the book, and finding the passage, brings it up an inch from her eyes to read. Her face and lips following the overheard words, the voice quite factual now. Can nothing be done to discern this human soul? The whole neighborhood would rush to save this woman if she were buried alive by the caving in of a pit, and labor with zeal until she were dug out. Now if there were one who had as such patience as zeal, he might awaken her to a consciousness of her immortal. When the boy's voice comes, Annie closes her eyes in pain. Annie, you there? Hush. Annie, what's that noise? Annie tries not to answer. Her own voice is drawn out of her, unwilling. Just a cot, Jimmy. Where they pushing it? To the dead house. Annie, does it hurt to be dead? Annie escapes by opening her eyes. Her hand works restlessly over her cheek. She retreats into the book again, but the cracked old crones interrupt, whispering. Annie slowly lowers the book. There are schools. There are schools outside. Schools where they teach blind ones, worse than you, to read and write. There is schools outside where there is schools. Silence. Annie sits with her eyes shining, her hand almost in a caress over the book. Then, you ain't going to school, are you, Annie? When I grow up? You ain't either, Annie. You're going to stay here, take care of me. I'm going to school when I grow up. You said we'll be together forever and ever and ever. I'm going to school when I grow up. Little girl, I must tell you, your brother will be going on a journey soon. Annie sits rigid in silence. Then the boy's voice pierces it, a shriek of terror. Annie! It goes into Annie like a sword. She doubles onto it. The book falls to the floor. It takes her a racked moment to find herself and what she has engaged in here. When she sees the suitcase, she remembers and lifts it once again toward the bed. But the voices are with her as she halts with suitcase in hand. Goodbye, Annie. Write me when you learn how. Don't tell anyone you came from here. Don't tell anyone. Yeah, don't tell anyone you came from. Yeah, don't tell anyone. Don't tell any. The echoing voices fade. After a moment, Annie lays the suitcase on the bed, and the last voice comes faintly from far away. Annie, it hurts to be dead forever. Annie falls to her knees by the bed, stifling her mouth in it. When at last she rolls blindly away from it, her palm comes down on the open report. She opens her eyes, regards it dully, and then, still on her knees, takes in the print. Might awaken her to a consciousness of her immortal nature. The chance is small indeed, but with a smaller chance they would have dug desperately for her in the pit, and is the life of the soul of less importance than that of the body. Annie gets to her feet. She drops the book on the bed and pauses over her suitcase. After a moment, she unclasps and opens it. Standing before it, she comes to her decision. She at once turns to the bureau and, taking her things out of its drawers, commences to throw them into the open suitcase. In the darkness, down left, a hand strikes a match and lights a hanging oil lamp. It is Keller's hand, and his voice accompanies it, very angry. The lights rising here before they fade on Annie show Keller and Kate inside a suggestion of a garden house with a bay window seat towards center and a door at back. Katie, I will not have it. Now you did not see when that girl, after supper tonight, went to look for Helen in her room. No. The child practically climbed out of her window to escape from her. What kind of teacher is she? I thought I had seen her at her worst this morning, shouting at me, but I come home to find the entire house disorganized by her. Helen won't stay 1 second in the same room, won't come to the table with her, won't let herself be bathed or undressed or put to bed by her, or even by Vinny now. And now the end result is that you have to do more for the children than before we hired this girl's services. From the moment she stepped off the train, she's been nothing but a burden, incompetent, impertinent, ineffectual, immodest. She folded her napkin. Captain, what? Not ineffectual. Helen did fold her napkin. What in heaven's name is so extraordinary about folding a napkin? Well, it's more than you did, Captain. Katie, I did not bring you all the way out here to the garden house to be frivolous. Now, how does Miss Sullivan propose to teach a deaf-blind pupil who won't let her even touch her? I don't know. The fact is, today she scuttled any chance she ever had of getting along with the child. If you can see any point of or purpose to her staying on here longer, it's more than what do you wish me to do? I want you to give her notice. I can't. Then if you won't, I must. I simply will not. He is interrupted by a knock at the back door. Keller, after a glance at Kate, moves to open the door. Annie, in her smoked glasses, is standing outside. Keller contemplates her heavily. Miss Sullivan, Captain Keller. She is nervous, keyed up to seizing the bull by the horns again, and she assumes a cheeriness which is not unshaking. Vinny said I'd find you both over here in the garden house. I thought we should have a talk. Yes, well, come in. Annie enters and is interested in this room. She rounds on her heel anxiously, studying it. Keller turns the matter over to Kate. Sado Katie, turning it back courteously. Captain. Keller clears his throat, makes ready. I wanted first to make my position clear to Miss Keller in private. I have decided I am not satisfied. In fact, am deeply dissatisfied with the manner in which, excuse me, is this little house ever in use? In the hunting season, if you will give me your attention, Miss Sullivan. Annie turns her smoked glasses upon him. They hold his unwilling stare. I have tried to make allowances for you because you come from a part of the country where people are women. I should say, come from for whom it began to elude him. Allowances must be made. I have decided, nevertheless, decide I, vexedly. Miss Sullivan, I find it difficult to talk through those glasses. Oh, of course. Why do you wear them? The sun has been down for an hour. Any kind of light hurts my eyes. Put them on, Miss Sullivan. I have decided to give you another chance. To do what? To remain in our employ. but on two conditions. I am not accustomed to rudeness in servants or women, and that is the first. If you are to stay, there must be a radical change of manner. Whose? Yours, young lady, isn't it obvious? And she second is and the second is that you persuade me there's the slightest hope of you teaching a child who flies from you now like the plague to anyone else she can find in this house. There isn't. What, Miss Annie? Kate stops sewing and fixes her eyes upon Annie. What, Miss Annie? It's hopeless here. I can't teach a child who runs away. Then do I understand you propose? Well, if we all agree it's hopeless, the next question is what? Miss Annie. She is leaning toward Annie in deadly earnest and commands both Annie and Keller. I am not agreed. I think perhaps you underestimate Helen. I think everybody here does. She did fold her napkin. She learns. She learns. Do you know she began talking when she was 6 months old? Could say water. Not really wah, but she meant water. She knew what it meant. And only 6 months old. I never saw a child so bright or outgoing. Her voice is unsteady, but she gets it level. It's still in her somewhere, isn't it? You should have seen her before her illness. Such a good-tempered child. She's changed. A pause. Kate not letting her eyes go. Her appeal at last is unconditional and very quiet. Miss Annie, put up with it. And with us. Us! Please. Like the lost lamb in the parable, I love her all the more. Miss Keller, I don't think Helen's worst handicap is deafness or blindness. I think it's your love and pity. Keller, now what does that mean? All of you here are so sorry for her. You've kept her like a pet. Why, even a dog you housebreak. No wonder she won't let me come near her. It's useless for me to try to teach her language or anything else here. I might as well. Miss Annie, before you came, we spoke of putting her in an asylum. What kind of asylum? For mental defectives. I visited there. I can't tell you what I saw. People like animals with rats in the halls, and she shakes her head on her vision. What else are we to do if you give up? Give up? You said it was hopeless. Here, give up. Why? I only today saw what has to be done to begin. She glances from Kate to Keller, who stare, waiting, and she makes it as plain and simple as her nervousness permits. I want complete charge of her. You already have that. It has resulted in, no, I mean day and night. She has to be dependent on me. For what? Everything. The food she eats, the clothes she wears, fresh. She is amused at herself through, though very serious. Air, yes, the air she breathes. Whatever her body needs is a primer to teach her out of. It is the only way. The one who lets her have it should be her teacher. She considers them in turn. They digest it, Keller frowning, Kate perplexed. Not anyone who loves her. You have so many feelings, they fall over each other like feet. You won't use your chances, and you won't let me. But if she runs from you to us, yes, that's the point. I'll have to live with her somewhere else. What? Till she learns to depend on and listen to me. For how long? As long as it takes. I packed half my things already. Miss is Sullivan. But when Annie attends upon him, he is speechless, and she is merely earnest. Captain Keller, it meets both your conditions. It's the one way I can get back in touch with Helen, and I don't see how I can be rude to you again if you're not around to interfere with me. And what is your intention if I say no? Pack the other half for home and abandon your charge to the asylum? She waits, appraises Keller's glare and Kate's uncertainty, and decides to use her weapons. I grew up in such an asylum. The state almshouse. Kate's head comes up on this, and Keller stares hard. Annie's tone is cheerful enough, I'll bet, level as gunfire. Rats, why? My brother Jimmy and I used to play with the rats because we didn't have toys. Maybe you'd like to know what Helen will find there. Not on visiting days. One ward was full of the old women, crippled, blind, most of them dying. But even if what they had was catching, there was nowhere else to move them. And that's where they put us. There were younger ones across the hall, prostitutes mostly, with TB and epileptic fits, and a couple of the kind who keep after other girls, especially young ones, and some insane. Some just had the DTs. The youngest were in another ward to have babies they didn't want. They started at 13, 14. They leave afterwards, but the babies stayed and we played with them too. Though a lot of them had sores all over from diseases you're not supposed to talk about, but of not many of them lived. The first year we had 80, 70 died. The room Jimmy and I played in was the dead house, where they kept the bodies till they could dig. Oh my dear, the graves. She is immune. Immune to Kate's compassion. No, it made me strong, but I don't think you need to send Helen there. She's strong enough. She waits again, but when neither offers her award, she simply concludes, "No, I have no conditions, Captain Keller." Miss Annie, yes. Where would you take Helen? Oh, what? She can't have everything. How would you would this garden house do? Furnish it? Bring Helen here after a long ride so she won't recognize it, and you can see her every day, if she doesn't know. Well, Kate, is that all? That's all. Kate, Captain. Keller turns his head, and Kate's request is quiet but firm. With your permission, why must she depend on you for the food she eats? I want control of it. Why? It's a way to reach her. You intend to starve her into letting you touch her? She won't starve. She'll learn. All's fair in love and war. Captain Keller, you never cut supplies. This is hardly a war. Well, it's not love. A siege is a siege. Miss Sullivan, do you like the child? Do you? You could have a servant here. I'll have enough work without looking after a servant. But that boy Percy could sleep here, run errands. We can let Percy sleep here, I think, Captain. And some old furniture all our own. Captain, do you think that walnut bedstead in the barn would be too? I have not yet consented to Percy, or to the house, or to the proposal, or to Miss Sullivan staying on when I very well I consent to everything. He shakes the cigar at Annie. For 2 weeks, I'll give you 2 weeks in this place, and it will be a miracle if you get the child to tolerate you. 2 weeks, Miss Annie. Can you accommodate? Can you accomplish anything in 2 weeks? Anything or not? 2 weeks. Then the child comes back to us. Make up your mind, Miss Sullivan, yes or no. 2 weeks for only one miracle? She nods at him nervously. I'll get her to tolerate me. Keller marches out and slams the door. Kate, on her feet, regards Annie, who is facing the door. You can't think as little of love as you said, or you wouldn't stay. I didn't come here for love. I came for money. Kate shakes her head to this with a smile. After a moment she extends her open hand. Annie looks at it, but when she puts hers out, it is not to shake hands. It is to set her fist in Kate's palm. Puzzle. A. It's the first of many. 26. Kate squeezes her fist, squeezes it hard, and hastens out after Keller. Annie stands as the door closes behind her, her manner so apprehensive that finally she slaps her brow, holds it, sighs, and with her eyes closed, crosses herself for luck. The lights dim into a cool silhouette scene around her. The lamp paling out, and now in formal entrances, persons appear around Annie with furniture for the room. Percy crosses the stage with a rocking chair and waits. Martha from another direction bears in a stool. Vinny bears in a small table, and the other Negro servant rolls in a bed part way from left, and Annie, opening her eyes to put her glasses back on, sees them. She turns around in the room and goes into action, pointing out locations for each article. The servants place them and leave, and Annie then darts around, interchanging them. In the midst of this, while Percy and Martha reappear with a tray of food and a chair, respectively, James comes down from the house with Annie's suitcase and stands viewing the room and her quizzically. Annie halts abruptly under his eyes, embarrassed, then seizes the suitcase from his hand, explaining herself brightly. I always wanted to live in a doll's house. She sets the suitcase out of the way and continues. Vinny at left appears to position a rod with drapes for a doorway, and the other servant at center pushes it in a wheelbarrow loaded with a couple of boxes of Helen's toys and clothes. Annie helps lift them into the room, and the servant pushes the wheelbarrow off, and none of this is any heed taken of the imaginary walls of the garden house. The furniture is moved in from every side and itself defines the walls. Annie now drags the box of toys into center, props up the doll on conspicuously on top, with the people melted away, except for James. All is again still. The lights turn again without pause, rising warmer. You don't let go of things easily, do you? How will you win her? How will you win her hand now in this place? Do I know? I lost my temper, and here we are. No touching, no teaching. Of course you are bigger. I'm not counting on force. I'm counting on her. That little imp is dying to know. Now what? Know what? Anything. Any and every crumb in God's creation. I'll have to use that appetite too. She gives the room a final survey, straightens the bed, arranges the curtains. Maybe she'll teach you. Of course. That she isn't. That there's such a thing as dullness of heart, acceptance, and letting go. Sooner or later, we all give up, don't we? Maybe you do. Maybe you all do. It's my idea of the original sin. What is giving up? You won't open her. Why can't you let her be? Have some pity on her for being what she is. If I'd ever once thought like that, I'd be dead. You will be. Why trouble? Or will you teach me? And with a bow, he drifts off. Now in the distance there comes the clomping of hooves drawing near and nearer up to the door, and they halt. Annie wheels to face the door. When it opens this time, the Kellers Kate in traveling bonnet. Keller our also hated R standing there with Helen between them. She is in a cloak. Kate gently cues her into the room. Helen comes in groping, baffled but interested in the new surroundings. Annie evades her exploring hand, her gaze not leaving the child. Does she know where she is? We rode her out in the country for 2 hours. For all she knows, she could be in another town. Helen stumbles over the box on the floor and in it discovers her doll and other battered toys. Is pleased, sits to them, then becomes puzzled and suddenly very weary. She scrambles up and back to her mother's thighs, but Annie steps in and it is hers that Helen embraces. Helen recoils, gropes, and touches her cheek instantly. That's her sign for me. I know. Helen waits, then recommences her groping more urgently. Kate stands indecisive and takes an abrupt step toward her, but Annie's hand is a barrier. In 2 weeks, Miss Annie, please be good to her. These 2 weeks, try to be very good to her. I will. Kate, turning then, hurries out. The Kellers cross back of the main house. Annie closes the door. Helen starts at the door ajar and rushes it. Annie holds her off. Helen kicks her, breaks free, and careens around the room like an imprisoned bird, colliding with furniture, groping wildly, repeatedly touching her cheek in a growing panic. When she has covered the room, she commences her weird screaming. Annie moves to comfort her, but her Tutson sailing into a paroxysm of rage. She tears away, falls over her box of toys, flings its content in handfuls in Annie's direction, flings the box too, reels to her feet, rips curtains from the window, bangs and kicks at the door, sweeps objects off the mantelpiece and shelf, a little tornado incarnate, all destruction until she comes up upon her doll and, in the act of hurling it, freezes. Then she clutches it to herself, and in exhaustion sinks sobbing to the floor. Annie stands contemplating her in some awe. 2 weeks. She shakes her head, not without a touch of disgusted bewilderment. What did I get into now? The lights have been dimming throughout, and the garden house is lit only by the moonlight now, with Annie lost in the patches of dark. Kate, now hatless and coatless, enters the family room by the rear door, carrying a lamp. Keller, also hatless, wanders simultaneously around the back of the main house to where James has been waiting in the rising moonlight on the porch. I can't understand it. I had every intention of dismissing that girl, not setting her up like an empress. Yes, what's her secret, sir? Secret? That enables her to get anything she wants out of you. When I can't. James turns to go into the house, but Keller gasps his wrist, twisting him half to his knees. Kate comes from the porch. She does not get anything she... Don't, Captain, he's afraid. He throws James away from him with contempt. What does he want out of me? My God, don't you know? He gazes from Keller to Kate. Everything you forgot when you forgot my mother. What? James wheels into the house. Keller takes a stride to the porch to roar after him. One thing that girl's secret is not, she doesn't fire one shot and disappear. Kate stands rigid and Keller comes back to her. Katie, don't mind what he... Captain, I am proud of you. For what? For letting this girl have what she needs. Why can't my son be... He can't bear me. You think I treat him as hard as this girl does, Helen? He breaks off as it dawns in him. Perhaps you do, but he has to learn some respect. Do you like the child? She turns again to the porch, but pauses reluctant. How empty the house is tonight. After a moment, she continues on in. Keller stands moveless as the moonlight dies on him. The distant belfry chimes toll. 2 o'clock, and with them, a moment later, comes the boy's voice on the wind in a whisper. Annie, Annie, in her patch of dark, Annie, now in her nightgown, hurls a cup into a corner as though it were her grief getting rid of its taste through her teeth. No, no pity, I won't have it. She comes to Helen, prone on the floor, on either of us. She goes to her knees, but when she touches Helen's hand, the child starts up, awake, recoils, and scrambles away from her under the bed. Annie stares after her. She strikes her palm on the floor with passion. I will touch you. She gets to her feet and paces in a kind of anger around the bed, her hand in her hair and confronting Helen at each turn. How do I... Annie stops, then she calls out urgently, loudly, Percy, Percy! She moves swiftly to the drapes at left. Percy, wake up! Percy's voice comes in a thick, sleepy mumble, unintelligible. Get out of bed and come in here. I need you. Annie darts away, finds and strikes a match, and touches it to the hanging lamp. The lights come up dimly in the room, and Percy stands bare to the waist in torn overalls between the drapes. With eyes closed, swaying, Annie goes to him, pats his cheeks vigorously. Percy, you awake? No. How would you like to play a nice game? Why, with Helen. She's under the bed. Touch her hand. She kneels Percy down at the bed, thrusting his hand under it to contact Helen's. Helen emits an animal sound and crawls to the opposite side, but commences sniffing. Annie rounds the bed with Percy and thrusts his hand again at Helen. This time, Helen clutches it, sniffs in recognition, and scrambling out air after Percy to hug him with delight. Percy, alarmed, struggles, and Helen's fingers go to his mouth. Let me go, let me go. Helen fingers her own lips as before, moving them in dumb imitation. She tryin' to talk. She gonna hit me. Grimly. She can talk if she only knew. I'll show you how. She makes letters. She opens Percy's other hand and spells into it. This one is ceasing. She hits his palm with it a couple of times. Her eyes upon Helen across him. Helen gropes to feel what Percy's hand is doing, and when she encounters Annie's, she falls back from them. She's mad at me now, though she won't play, but she knows lots of letters. Here's another, A-C-A-C-A. But she is watching Helen, who comes groping, consumed with curiosity. Annie makes the letters in Percy's hand, and Helen pokes to question what they are up to. Then Helen snatches Percy's other hand and quickly spells 4 letters into it. Annie follows them aloud. C-A-K-E. She spells cake. She gets cake. She is swiftly over to the tray of food to fetch cake and a jug of milk. She doesn't know yet it means this. Isn't it funny? She knows how to spell it and doesn't know she knows. She breaks the cake in 2 pieces and extends one to each. Helen rolls away from her offer. Well, if she won't play it with me, I'll play it with you. Would you like to learn one she doesn't know? No, no. But Annie seizes his wrist and spells to him, Milkm. This is this I? That's an easy one. Just the little finger. L is this. And Helen comes back with her hand to feel the new word. Annie brushes her away and continues spelling aloud to Percy. Helen's hand comes back again and tries to get in. Annie brushes it away again. Helen's hand insists, and Annie puts it away rudely. No, why should I talk to you? I'm teaching Percy a new word. LK is this. Helen now yanks her hands apart. She butts Percy away and thrusts her palm out insistently. Annie's eyes are bright with glee. Oh, you're jealous, are you? Helen's hand waits intractably, waits. All right. Annie spells into it milk, and Helen, after a moment, spells it back to Annie. Annie takes her hand with her whole face shining. She gives a great sigh. Good, so I'm finally back to where I can touch you, Touch and go. No love lost. But here we go. She puts the jug of milk into Helen's hand, and she squeezes Percy's shoulder. You can go to bed now. You've earned your sleep. Thank you. Percy, stumbling up, weaves his way out through the drapes. Helen finishes drinking and holds the jug out for Annie. When Annie takes it, Helen crawls onto the bed and makes for sleep. Annie stands, looks down at her. Now all I have to teach you is one word. Everything. She sets the jug down on the floor now. Annie spies the doll, stoops to pick it up, and with it dangling in her hand, turns off the lamp. A shaft of moonlight is left on Helen in the bed, and a second shaft on the rocking chair. And Annie, after putting off her smoked glasses, sits in the rocker with the doll. She is rather happy, and dangles the doll on her knee, and it makes its mamma sound. Annie whispers to it in mock solicitude, Hush, little baby, don't say a word. She lays it against her shoulder and begins rocking with it, patting its diminutive behind. She talks the lullaby to it, humorously at first. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird. If that mockingbird don't sing. The rhythm of the rocking takes her into the tune softly and more tenderly. Mama's gonna buy you a diamond ring. If that diamond ring turns to brass. A third shaft of moonlight outside now rises to pick out James at the main house, with one foot on the porch step. He turns his body as if hearing the song. Mama's gonna buy you a looking glass. If that looking glass gets broke. In the family room, a fourth shaft picks out Keller, seated at the table, in thought, and he too lifts his head as if hearing. Mama's gonna buy you a billy goat. If that billy goat won't pull. The fifth shaft is upstairs in Annie's room and picks out Kate, pacing there, and she halts, turning her head too as if hearing. Mama's gonna buy you a cart and bull. If that cart and bull turns over, Mama's gonna buy you a dog named Rover. If that dog named Rover won't bark. With the shafts of moonlight on Helen and James and Keller and Kate all moveless, and Annie rocking the doll, the curtain ends the act. And that is the end of Act 2.